dear listener, and welcome to the Metacast brought to you by Naavik. In this Crypto Corner episode, we are talking about something important, something that might not, appeal or many people do not want to think about, but I think it's relevant. We're going to talk about regulation and the law and how DAOs are seen by international regulation. We're going to talk about security tokens versus utility tokens, IP on the blockchain, and other interesting stuff and important stuff. So my name is Nico. I'm your host today. I'm also an investor at Bitcraft, and I have the pleasure of being joined by Omri Bouton, who is the blockchain, crypto, NFT, and Web3 lawyer at Sheridans. Omri, you and I, we met a bit more than 6 months ago. We had a fantastic dinner together, philosophizing about blockchain and other stuff. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Nico. It's great to be here, and I love your podcast. So yeah, definitely very happy to join you on this episode.
Cool. Well, I know that because we're talking about regulation, and you're going to be talking about how you think or how you think about things and what people should be careful of. Maybe you want to first caveat a little bit in the beginning before we start talking about stuff.
Of course, yeah. As always, this is not legal advice, and it's not something that lawyers just say because to be boring. It's just because we are going to discuss aspects that are quite difficult also for lawyers, that practice in the space to really digest and apply. A lot of these come down to interpretation, especially because it's a new area with new regulation. There isn't much guidance out there yet. And also because, really each case can vary quite a lot. So, reasoning by way of analogy, in my opinion, is one of the best way to get it wrong in this space. And, that's why it's quite challenging to try and help and create content. It's important that people understand, listener understand that this should be a starting point, on the kind of educational framework that listeners and people who want to, partake within the industry can start from, but it shouldn't represent, what they're basing their idea on. Also because, or their business model on. Also because a lot of what we're going to discuss, if not all of it, is very much jurisdictional. Meaning, I'm practicing in the UK. Most of what I'm going to say is going to relate to, the state of affairs now in the UK, which is likely to change, within a few weeks, based on some of the, news that are coming out. So yeah, just take everything, carefully. It's more of an educational conversation. Please do not, go off and start structuring a business model around what we're going to discuss. But what you can do is, you can take this information and use it as a ramp to go and learn more about it.
If people are listening to this and think, holy shit, that Omri knows what he's talking about, how can people find you?
You can. I'm Omri Bouton, at Omri Bouton on Twitter. I never really used Twitter before, becoming part of this community. But it's the greatest platform, I think, to bring together the crypto and NFT community. And otherwise on LinkedIn, same, or on Sheridans, sheridan.co.uk, like that's the website of the firm I work at, which is a media and entertainment firm. We also cover sports, esports. There is a very large, video game, interactive entertainment practice. We deal with VR, AR, music, film and TV, theater, and then now, of course, crypto and NFT forms a big part. And it really all I do day in, day out. So,
mm-hmm. And I've indirectly worked with Omri through deals that we did in the UK, and those went pretty smoothly. So I can attest that working with Omri and Sheridans is
that means a lot. Thanks.
There you go. Cool. All right, let's dive in. So first thing I'd like to have your thoughts on very broadly, and I'd just like to understand what is important to keep in mind around the concept of a DAO. Yeah. So a decentralized autonomous organization. Currently, everything is becoming a DAO. Yeah. And what is important to keep in mind here? What is a DAO from a legal point of view? What are some examples you can point to where you can say this is done well or this is done wrong, etc.
Yeah. So DAO stands for decentralized autonomous organization, and what people refer to when they refer to a DAO, let's say the utopical ideal is to be able to group together and through a membership, a token of membership, normally be it an NFT or some quantities of fungible currencies, and be able to pull funds together in order to achieve a certain goal that is common to everyone. Like that's actually a definition that I heard from Beeple on a podcast, on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I found it fascinating. Is says that it's a very powerful device because you can really gather people together around the same goal, and this time is not just a group on social network, but it also has an economy embedded into it with some with capital to deploy. Before we go into the legal aspect, let's say, I think DAOs are very interesting, and they can really become collective efforts, and I think that a key part of the DAO revolves around, and a healthy way to structure a DAO revolves around contributions. So, each member of the DAO theoretically should contribute. So it's not really a company where you buy shares and then you have the director managing everything. But I think that, to function properly, a DAO should have members that contribute to it, because otherwise all you're doing really, you're trying to set up a DAO to avoid all of the regulatory aspect, around anti-money laundering, all of the regulation governing companies and issuance of shares and equity. So, I think there is a place for DAOs, but I think that the focal point should be that members contribute to it, to the to achieving the goal that the DAO, is founded on. So that's one part. And second, I think it's something that I'd like to highlight. It's a podcast again, Joe Rogan, with the producer, the director of The Social Dilemma. And, I think there are arguments for and against social networks and all what's happening to big data. I'm not necessarily just against it. I think that there is a lot of, useful use cases. There are a lot of useful use cases for that. But what's interesting is that, of course, the NFT space particularly, and also crypto, includes, a degree of anonymity. Like it's based on, to a degree, it's based on anonymity. And if you look, for example, at the first case with Bitcoin, it really is based on someone or a group of people or an entity that is anonymous. And, that's really what gave it the narrative and some of its power, because then the regulator cannot really pinpoint, liability or onto anyone, because no one knows who's behind it. So I think anonymity is a core part of this industry, at least at this stage. And part of what we need to ask ourselves is, there is machine learning that is already capable of passing Turing tests on social network, and that is used and deployed in order to create issues within different countries. This is not speculation. This is all information that is available out there. And I think the collective tend to underestimate how clever these machine learning can be. And when you look at DAOs, I think there is an inherent risk coupled with this accepted degree of anonymity within the industry, so that we are following anonymous people on Twitter that are being quoted in the news, that are being interviewed by anyone, and you don't really know who these people are. And when you can gather a capital, for example, I think Constitution DAO gather like 40 million in a week, maybe, that's considerable capital. You can start doing some damage to companies out there, and so I think if knowing that human beings have been hacked from a point of view of influencing their decisions, and looking at DAOs and how they operate normally through voting systems which are largely unscrutinized and unregulated, then I think there is a risk there to consider. But I'm not a pessimist, and I'm very positive about the role of the DAO, especially because there is a difference. You can structure DAOs at different levels, right? So you can have a DAO effectively should include, people are trying to include the distribution of capital or revenue that the DAO generates. That's the more kind of red flag circumstance from a legal perspective, because of course the membership start to look a lot more like a form of security, whereby you passively accrue, value, money or money's worth. And then there is another one. And then the second aspect of it, which is governance, which can also be a red flag and can also, trigger security concerns. But more generally, you can structure governance over perhaps certain aspects that are not the equivalent of the company itself or the direction of the company, but rather, for example, aspects of a platform or of a game, perhaps, related more to the narrative and the content. So I think that, when we speak about DAO, it's also important to understand, first of all, what aspect that is related to. Is it about distributing revenue to the members? And second, is it is it about governance? And if we're talking about governance, then at what level does the governance come in? And similarly, on the distribution of revenue, what is the justification behind the distribution of revenue? Is it simply holding the membership pass and being part of a DAO, or is it based on a contribution? Because then if you look at the contribution, then it starts looking a little bit more like a service. So it's like payment in return of a service that you provide to the collective, which I'm not saying is risk-free, but if you're looking at it in the form of a spectrum, receiving something without doing anything for it looks a lot like a security. Receiving a payment for service rendered start to look a little bit more like a service provision. Again, with that said, it's not legal advice, and that's why I'm saying we're discussing aspects, if you want, in the abstract, and it's very important that people don't just say, okay, so all I need to do is provide a service and we're good. No, it's more complex than that. So please, don't go heads on into that. But this is, when you look at DAO and the kind of risk, this is, I think, it's a framework to start considering. So you have, what is the goal behind the DAO? What are the members, required to do? And what are, the reward that can come from that? And what are at what level is the governance operating at? Is it like determining how the entire DAO operates and all of the decision? Again, it can be risky. Is it only a minor aspect and not, let's say, the governance of the collective itself? Less of a risk, but still something to consider, definitely. So.
And when you say risk, do you mean that the government would consider the DAO not a DAO, but just a company? Is that then the risk that you're running when setting something like that up?
Well, so this is the difficulty, right? Because when you're looking at companies and also some type of partnership, you can have a limited liability on top of it, meaning that, the company itself and the limited partnership becomes, has a separate legal personality, meaning that it's almost as if it were, it is a person. It's called a legal person. And that's why company can enter into agreement with others, and commit to, services or payments or enter into obligations. The problem is that if a DAO is, only a DAO in understanding, but has no formal structure behind it, then potentially what you're having is some form of unlimited partnership, meaning that you don't have a separate separate personality that, kind of places a separation between what the entity is doing and the members. It's just, it's a free flow. So all of the member would be liable to an uncapped extent, both in terms of, say if there is a contractual breach, but also like in terms of regulation, and I think when I'm talking about risk, really what I'm saying is the risk of falling under financial services regulation, anti-money laundering regulation, and breaching any such regulation by virtue of not, operating within the regulated space in accordance with the framework that is set by the government, and by the legislator. Yeah.
And so am I so I'm part of a bunch of DAOs, some of them of which I just, tangentially got some tokens for some reason, or maybe I liked it, so I bought a handful.
Yeah.
Am I potentially at risk in an extreme case of being seen as liable for things that get done by that group of people?
So these are the difficult questions that, I should refrain answering on a podcast, because of course there are a lot of factors that goes into it. For example, where are you residing? What are the rules that govern, but ultimately, and this is more of an opinion, it's more like how I think some regulator would go about it. It's more about who issues and who benefits from the issuance of the membership tokens, let's say, whether NFT or not. You purchasing it could be seen maybe an innocent party, and then it depends. If you become part of a member and you start receiving revenue and you become more involved within the DAO, then maybe there might be an extent of liability on you as well. But
So I should find a boat and go live in international waters.
Yeah, exactly. Like the pirate radio in the 80s and 90s. It's a difficult framework. And I think, that's part of the challenge that comes with decentralization is it's very difficult to apply normal rules to some of these scenarios, because there is a jurisdictional element that is hard to enforce. DeFi represent a massive problem, for example, I think from the point of view of the regulator, because it's really hard to understand how you regulate it. And regulation should exist to protect consumers, right? And I think that that's a positive. But then the problem is that how do you make sure that you don't go overboard and, stifle innovation by requiring project to, too much, by requiring too much, an oversight. And the problem that we have, I think, here in the UK at least, is that there is a risk, at least for projects that are involved in cryptographic asset, to fall, especially NFTs, let's say, because to fall within the requirements of the new dedicated anti-money laundering framework, and that requires registration with the regulator, with the Financial Conduct Authority. Now, the registration itself is not a license. So normally a license, the regulator has to authorize you and by providing you a license. So basically the activity is illegal unless you get an authorization by the regulator, for which there is an application process. This registration process should be more of a disclosure, but in reality it is quite demanding. And again, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Before moving to the UK a year ago, I worked in Gibraltar, where where companies and entities basically that provide services via the blockchain, be it transfer of value belonging to others or custodianship services, are regulated and require a license. I don't think that was a bad framework. There was certainty. It was expensive. It wasn't for everyone, but large exchanges could come and go through the entire process, and at the end of it, get a license. Now, the license wouldn't necessarily entitle you to operate everywhere in the world, because it's not a harmonized framework, meaning that you can't passport the blockchain like this blockchain like DLT license, how it is called, elsewhere, because it's not recognized, at least at this stage. But at least if you have, first of all, the process itself should take you from a point of at the end of this process, you should be a serious company that understands how regulation work, that has mechanism in place to protect consumer, and be as compliant as possible. So the process to apply for an authorization is useful also as a learning curve, because as part of that application, you would need to implement internal policy, you would need to appoint a competent personnel, and so on and so forth. So I definitely do think that there is space for that. The problem comes in the form of, let's say you're a creative and you want to leverage some of the benefit that blockchain technology provides, and then suddenly you're required to comply with, a list of obligations that are more tailored to, financial services provider or financial technology provider. And I think that's the problem. It's almost like saying, well, I'm going to regulate every piece of paper like a security, because potentially there could be, that could be a share. And I think, I'm not saying this is the case right now, but I think that that's the challenge. It's how do you distinguish one from the other, especially when the pace of innovation is so quick, and I mean, I'm not, of course, a developer. And you can see that also, for example, within the very definition of what is a fungible token and what is a non-fungible token, right? Because we give that for granted, but we take that for granted. But so we say, okay, here, like on Ethereum, ERC20, it's a standard that is used for fungible currency. 721 is non-fungible. And 1155, what is it? It's a hybrid. You can have different classes and different volume for each class. So at what point in volume do you start deeming ERC 1155 as fungible? Or, do we just deem them as non-fungible because they're capable of having, potentially of operating as a non-fungible cryptographic asset? So, all of these questions, it's very hard to regulate the space. And I think, the way that Gibraltar went about it, they were regulating the service provider rather than trying to regulate the technology. And I think that there is some benefit to that, in that you don't have to get the definition of the technology right. You say, you just focus on, well, it's recorded by way of distributed ledger technology, and what are the services that you provide. But again, it's still underdeveloped. I think that there is a bit of misunderstanding on the part of the industry because you hear often, oh, there is no regulation. No, there are regulation in place. The problem is that there is lack of guidance, and that some of the regulation, might struggle to capture or regulate appropriately new development within the space.
That's interesting. If I let's say I'm building a game, and one part of that game will be a DAO. I've heard that I've seen that many blockchain games tend to go towards like islands in the Caribbean to set up the DAO and where the legal entity exists. Is that because they're just more flexible there? And is that,
be, yeah.
Do you think, how this will continue?
Yeah, it could be, but there's always a risk, because some regulation are limited to the place of incorporation of the company, or the place where the person that creates the project is resident in. Other form of regulation have extraterritorial effect, in that if you're based elsewhere but you're providing services into a jurisdiction, then you become subject to the regulation of that jurisdiction as well. there might be challenges on the part of the government to enforce anything if you have no presence here, but that doesn't mean that you're not infringing. So and that's especially true when it comes to financial services, like offering securities within a territory normally triggers that territory, the regulatory obligation from that territory, and that also applies to gambling because, like the blockchain regulation that I mentioned before, it's gambling is a sensitive topic, and each jurisdiction is going about it differently based on how they deem it, and based on the sensitivity of the collective, of the community. So it's not harmonized, meaning that for gambling, for example, some jurisdictions do not regulate it. Some jurisdictions make it illegal, and some jurisdictions regulate it, requiring you to obtain a license if your activity falls within the regulation. So, going back to the offshore entity, some of the structures, and you can see that, for example, I think with ApeCoin, I think that there are Cayman, some of these structure would have a foundation for the issuance of the token. The goal of the foundation being that of promoting the token, and then they can commission, to studios of creative around the world work for the foundation. So that places some separation there. But again, you really need to look at the details of how that is done, because when it comes to regulation, it doesn't really matter what's in your terms and what's in the agreement. What matters is what's going on in reality. It's a question of substance. So, the way that it's not. And you don't really joke when it comes to financial services and gambling as well, because those are sensitive areas of regulation. A regulator can be very, and look at the SEC and the FCA. They can be very severe with the kind of liability.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, if I understand you correctly, and this is what I've seen quite a few times with companies, is that they set up a so they want to build a game which has a treasury, and so they set up a DAO that of which a certain percentage of the tokens, right? You have the typical tokenomics distribution.
You have like an insider reserve, part of
it
it being for the treasury. Yeah,
exactly. And so 20% is kept for the company, so the initial company, the entity that actually builds the game.
Yeah.
And then there is a service agreement between the two where the DAO actually pays on a yearly basis, like a small fee, I guess, right? Because the company actually also owns X% of the tokens, which is their long-term incentives to make this work.
Yeah, I mean that really boils down to how you structure the consideration, meaning the payment from the entity, from the foundation, let's say, or like this, let's say the group that is issuing the token to the company that is creating the content on commission. So that really depends, and you see structure of all kind. What I would say is that having viewed a few term sheet and deal agreements between VCs and projects, I think you need to be very careful in entering even in term sheets and agreements with an entity in a place where the issuance of token is regulated or forbidden, just because you want to make sure that you don't create obligations for the companies that you cannot meet, because you would be breaching regulation, but then you would be breaching the contract that you've entered into. So the VC, you're in a sandwich where you don't want to be. So and I think that I'm not trying to be catastrophic. I think all of what we are discussing can be done. All I'm saying is that if you are the founder of a project, you should give this proper thought. There is investment right now. The incentive is considerable, because if you have a good project, you're going to monetize it. So I think be formal about it, and be as formal as possible. There is inherently a degree of risk in operating in this industry. That's just part of it. And I think everyone, that operates within this has a bit of a higher risk appetite than the norm. And that goes for yourself, for me, for anyone that is, a degen. So I think I'm not trying to dissuade people from doing that. I'm just saying, just don't be dismissive. It's and in Italy we say "patti chiara amicizia lunga," which means like if everything is clear at the outset, the friendship is going to last a long time. So try to really understand what are the issues that can come from, especially for example, a VC investment into a target, and from both ends, and then try to mitigate as much risk as possible, so that you don't have bad relationship later on in life, but you can just focus on creating this interoperable space together between the VC and the companies that the VC is investing in. And I think just to give a couple of pointers so that people can try, so that I can effectively be clear on what I'm referring to. You should, for example, when you're investing in when a VC comes around, normally there is a pro rata allocation out of some form of reserve, an insider reserve. Now, the trigger for that reserve, you need to be careful on how you craft it, because you don't. If say, a lot of time you see very wide wording saying, well, whenever tokens are created, issued, distributed, allocated. That means basically anything you do with the token would trigger that clause, and they need to create an insider reserve, right? And I think that's a problem, because what happens if, say, the company issues 100 tokens, 40%, say, let's look at 38, let's look at ApeCoin, is distributed amongst the insider, because that's, an event that triggers the distribution to all shareholders. Okay, the rest of the 60, the company should be in a position to decide how much to sell, maybe via an exchange, how much to inject within the economy of a game, for it to be sustainable. And let's say you later on, and you keep some of it. If the company decide then to allocate more, of that token in the game, that should not trigger another allocation to the insider, because that bundle of tokens has already been subject to the first allocation, And I don't think that would be a point of a contentious point between the VCs and the investors and the titles, because it's in everyone's interest that the economy of the game is sustainable. Because if the economy is unsustainable, no one is going to play your game. So I think that's why I wanted to mention this.
One of the great potential that I believe this concept of Web3 has is that it is just a very low barrier of being able to do interesting things and collaborating with people without having, to go through all of the hassle of setting up a legal entity and, hiring people like yourself. No offense, Omri, but you're expensive. Not everyone wants to.
I'm actually quite good in terms of price. I'm quite junior.
There you go. There you go. We're very much shilling Omri and Sheridans here. So my question is, so let's say a few months ago, actually a long while ago, I've made the promise, or I said that I was thinking about launching Metacast NFTs. I'm actually still intend to do that, people.
Yeah.
It's just I'm lazy. Also, I get concerned when I am on calls like this. But so my question is, if I, as an individual, as a group, or like with a group of friends, want to set up a DAO and do an experiment with fun stuff where we allocate maybe just a bit of money where we can play around and do some random stuff. How do you think that how should we approach it? How should we think about it? Do we need to take it so serious as you just described?
I would. I mean, it depends. Again, it goes back to the beginning of this part that we're discussing now. It depends. Like, is there any sort of flow? Are there funds flowing back to the members? Are there allocation being made? What is the governance relating to? And is there a need for a DAO? Because a lot of these can be implemented also without it. The reality of fact, you say that a lot of these mechanisms are great because they allow people to collaborate and partner without all of the formalities that normally would apply, which, they do apply, but you can disregard. I think you can gain access to capital without going through this, but you might, incur you might breach regulation in doing so. Maybe you just don't appreciate it at first. But then the question is, do you need a DAO? And I think that doesn't only apply to a DAO, that applies a bit for everything, like staking. A lot of times staking is used also, for multiple, to refer to multiple use cases. Because on a proof of stake, staking allows, a particular entity to become a validator within the ecosystem, right? Whereas staking used on Ethereum, whilst it's proof of work, unless the smart contract operates in some curious way where there is some form of staking, I'm not sure if you can implement that within the smart contract itself. To be honest, I'm not as technical at that level. But most often it's just a reward staking, meaning maybe it has an anti-deflationary effect by incentivizing people and locking away certain amounts, but you're not really serving any purpose to the network. And that has, so one term can already have different levels of risk, which is why it's very important to go down to the root of what are you referring to when you refer to staking. What are you referring to when you're referring to a DAO? And I think that projects are also feel that they have, in order to compete within this industry, they have to provide outstanding value to the collectors in the form of financial gains. And, my question is, okay, for some community, that's great. And, no one complains receiving money, myself included. But the question is, if you are building a community around, say, a common interest or a particular goal, do you really need to buy your community? Because you're going to incentivize a lot of people, that are only there to get the tokens that you're allocating, to get you incentivize a type of collector that is not really a collector and doesn't really resonate with the goal that you have in mind, but rather someone that is just there for the money. And I'm not saying that it's something bad on the part of the collector. If there is free money, why not? Or like free money up until the tax point, because that's also another part. But you know what I mean? Like if you have a flow of value from a project, then that's great. But I don't think that it's necessary. If you have a great product, I've played World of Warcraft for 10 years. And I buy skins and cosmetic in other games, and I don't get anything back, which I think is something that the blockchain does address. And I couldn't wait for a technology like this to come around, because I think that as gamers, you invest a lot of time and effort and money to, accrue value within a game, but then it's locked within the ecosystem. And that's a problem that I think the blockchain can solve. But I think that's different, than saying, okay, yeah, I'm releasing a project. Then if you're I'm going to keep dropping token onto you, and you can sell them on secondary market. You can do it. I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm saying be careful, because if you're only basing your product on that, then what's your product? Is it just really like some form of financial incentive product masked with a UX of like cute characters? Because that could be the case, and again, just be clear on what is that you want and what community you want to end up with and how sustainable you want your product to be. So I think those are some pointers. I probably sound like a hater, by the way. I actually love this space. I'm full on degen. I buy any NFT you can think of.
That's right. You like to lose money on the internet, so that's yeah.
I'm collecting.
That's good. That's good to know. One thing that I see and that I actually like seeing is, so I see quite a lot of startup projects coming to me. We now broadly distinguish between two token or a multi-token model and a one token model, right? So one token model is so that token is both utility inside the game, as well as the token that investors would hold, or that would in some shape, way, or form accrue value over time. A multi-token model is there's one token, which we usually call the governance token, although it doesn't necessarily have to give governance, that attempts to capture the value, and that is the token that is usually also uncapped. Capped. So there's a limited supply, and then so there's the governance token on one hand, and then there's utility token, or like one or multiple utility tokens within the game that are then usually uncapped and are used to manage liquidity. Like if no new people arrive,
the game,
you can.
You mean?
Sorry?
You mean exactly, the economy of the game,
and so they give more flexibility. And so my question is, what is for you the distinction between a utility and or what is a security token and what is not, I guess?
Okay.
For you, or what is seen as a security and what is not?
The good thing is that we actually have a definition provided by the regulator on what's the difference. And a security token is a token that has characteristics that are inherent to financial instrument. So something that looks like a unity in a collective investment scheme, something that operates like a security, like a share in a company. You have a list of items of instrument that are deemed as securities, and a security token would be a cryptographic asset that behaves like one of those, so that meets the tests that are applied to understand whether an instrument falls within one of these categories. You also have e-money tokens, which is another electronic money are regulated. Stable coins tend to be more relevant to that, although not all stable coin are e-money. And then you have utility tokens, which are tokens that don't fall within the definition of a security token or an e-money token, which doesn't mean that the utility token is not regulated. You could fall within anti-money laundering, for example, and within financial promotion, although that has not yet been regulated. There are consultation paper out that suggest that non-fungible token will be excluded, at least here in the UK, whereas fungible token will be included. So there are rules governing the financial promotion of instrument, and cryptographic asset will likely be subject to these. Security token and e-money token are already subject to financial promotion rules as security or as e-money. So it's more for the utility token part. What else? I wanted to say something. I forgot about it now. There was an interesting point. But yeah, in general, in terms of the multi-token dynamic, I think that really comes down to tokenomics, which I don't really think. I see it, I deal with it as part of my role, but there are people that specialize in that and products that are designed to understand if an economy is sustainable or not. So and I think those are important because even in traditional video games, the economy of the game really does affect the enjoyability of the game itself. And so, when you're getting into blockchain product, that's even more important because there is direct correlation to the value of the assets you hold with the how efficient and sustainable the economy is within the game. But also, we're talking about now having a Web 2 approach to Web 3 technologies. But also, if you look at Loot, for example, and Lootverse, I know that you're familiar with David and what is the Crypt
Yeah.
and all of that. I think that's very interesting as well. You can have different structure in that you can have people that design assets for a game, and then you can have people that design experiences to incorporate those assets. I think that's interesting. And we're starting to talk about interoperability, and I think that what's very interesting is that I see at least two types of interoperability that are building up. One comes from VC at a VC level. If you look at perhaps also Bitcraft and Imoca, you have a lot of investment in a lot of companies, and then it's easier for that to be a network that then communicate with each other. And I think that the first stage for that would be regulatory interoperability, which is why I thought it was very interesting for Yuga Lab to ask for KYC. Have you seen that?
No.
It was handled, I think, it wasn't handled great on the communication side because the community, it was to be expected. If you come in the middle of the market and you request people for proof of for IDs and proof of residence and all of that, people are not going to react well. And I think the tweet was something along the line.
Could you elaborate on exactly what they were asking?
Yeah. So effectively, they were running due diligence on people that were interested in the project. So to enter, into and we don't know yet what the project is, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
So it's, they were asking for a proof of identities. So that means an ID or, driving license and a proof of address, which is, for example, what most businesses have to do anyway. But in a space where, there is none of that, then suddenly putting that type of barrier where there are a lot of people that are anonymous and don't want to dox themselves, then it's a gamble. And I think that Yuga Lab is probably one of the only company that could have pulled that off, and sustain the backlash, because how many times clients come and they have great ideas, and then all of these kind of regulatory burden force them to take more time and understand how to structure it, when they could really implement, KYC and due diligence measure, but that would mean that as they approach market, they would just, tank, because right now the industry doesn't accept that yet. So the fact that Yuga Lab did it first, I think, was important for the space, because then they can start educating the market as to potentially, what's going to come. I'm a lawyer and this is the regulation. Good or bad for the space, I'm all for innovation. So, but you also have a commercial reality, and a legal reality that applies to you if you're a service provider. So I understand why you could feel very much against that. Unfortunately, it's something that regulations seem to be going toward that end. But that's how what happened. And I think right after that happened, then they announced that they purchased Banks and Meebit. So it was almost like, don't get too angry here. So you have IP over your Bank. So yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, I consider myself a libertarian, where I think giving people freedom and allowing for easy value exchange on the internet is actually a good thing. I think, automated market makers, platforms like Uniswap, SushiSwap, etc., are actually great, amazing inventions. Where, I believe in a tokenized future where,
me too. That's why I'm
almost everything will be tokenized. Is that for you, from your legal point of view, realistic to I see a world where in 5 years time, all company shares are actually, ERC20 tokens.
Yeah. But I think, the use cases that we're discussing are quite limited, because in reality, the distributed ledger and the blockchain can be used for many applications. And there is, of course, even just from the authentication standpoint, it'd be great for a number of certificates. So yeah, I do think that would be the case. And not every distributed ledger or not every blockchain needs to be public. So blockchains are already used within the banking system and within financial service provider as part of their internal mechanism. But they're just not public. Unlike, for example, Bitcoin and Ethereum, where you can go and see what happens on the ledger. So you can really design one however you want. I think if you want to be, if you want to look at the dystopic future, then I think you look at all form of fiat money being on the blockchain as stablecoin and being trackable to the point where you basically everything you do with your money is subject to someone review or potentially. And I think that's terrifying, because I think that there is there isn't data on your financial dealings, financial data on people is so sensitive. I don't think people appreciate how sensitive that is. If I know what you spend on, I know you better than if I speak with you, because you can put on a facade when you speak, but what you spend on really defines a large part of your person. And I think that information is very sensitive. So,
are you judging me for my Barbie collection, Omri?
Well, yeah, I expected you to be a Ken collector like myself, but but it's it's I think it's, and not public just for other people to view, but more for government. Think about all of the backlash there has been, in respect of now with all of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. I'm not saying one is right, one is wrong, but I'm saying there has been a lot of backlash because people were unable to access their funds, some of their funds, and to put pressure on the government in Russia. Imagine if everything is on a blockchain that is centralized, because you can have decentralized chains, but you can also have centralized one, or with the centralized point of access. So I think that's the dystopic future. And in my opinion, and many of your listeners and yourself might hate me for saying that, but I think that part of that dystopic future also includes a very big leap in virtual reality, because I think that and especially if coupled with pollution and carbon credit being on chain, tied to your identity, becomes very dystopic. Because if you look at how carbon credits are now, which is, I think it's arbitrary. I'm not an environment lawyer, but I think that they're, effectively you're trying to offset pollution that you're generating by purchasing carbon credit, which are generated by carbon credit farms. So you plant trees and fuel it. But so some companies are given quotas, meaning that you have a certain amount of allowance, and then if you go above that, you need to go on the market and purchase more to offset your carbon footprint. Now the problem with that is, imagine if in the future, because the environment is not getting any better, imagine if in the future the carbon credit allowance would be applied to us. So that basically you have a certain amount of carbon allowance that you spend by taking flights, by driving a car, by and just living. And then you track that, and if you exhaust it, then you need to purchase it. You need to purchase an additional carbon credit. I think then society will be de-incentivized, or will simply not be able to afford carbon credits required to, for example, travel the world and see things in real life. But then maybe there won't be a need, because again, you're going to have the virtual representation, and perhaps even with certain perks that would stimulate our brain more. And so I think it would become very much of an anchor, right? Whereas the utopia, or at least the future, I'm very hopeful about. And again, I might sound very negative. I'm actually super excited about all of this technological advancement. I absolutely love it. I've been passionate about it for years. But the future that I'm looking at is an augmented reality-based future, and with blockchain, in order to be able to trade augmented assets, and have virtual assets that effectively feel real and are as unique as real item. Because then what happened is, it can have also, talking about environment, but it's just one example, it can have a very positive effect, because then suddenly you can mass reduce, the amount of product that you create, and you can just have those products produced digitally and then transfer to you. And you can, for example, in case of fashion, you can wear them, if they look real, if they feel real, if we're able to stimulate our brain to a sufficient degree so that the augmentation is not limited only to the visual element, but also to the other senses, then I think that becomes very positive for our society. Also because it potentially can be a technology that enhances the way we communicate between each other and incentivizes us to communicate with each other in real life. And at the same time, if you look at augmented reality and you go, let's say, full dive, then you can still have virtual reality, which is super. It can have really, really cool applications, especially around the interactive entertainment space. But I think, that's the kind of future that I'm hopeful for, and that I'm trying to push as much as possible from my end.
Fascinating. And I feel like every time you and I talk, we tend to end up somewhere philosophical.
Yeah, completely.
But I love it.
But
I love it.
Started from the house, end of the world.
Yeah, good. So although I'd love to dig deeper into this, because I also have my thoughts around, how I see an ideal future tokenized and how it makes sense. Let's try keep on topic for the podcast. Next thing I'd like to have your thoughts on is IP on the blockchain.
Yeah.
It is something that a lot of big brands are very concerned about.
Yeah.
Could you tell me how you're thinking around that, why it is important, etc.?
Yeah. So I think if you look at intellectual property, let's start just setting the framework, and then we go on to the risk. So intellectual properties are negative rights. It means that if you have an intellectual property, if you own a certain piece of intellectual property, then you have the right to stop others from doing something with that property that is deemed to belong to you. So that's what's a negative right. So you have the ability to exercise it to stop someone else from doing something. Now, the problem with IP and blockchain, but even more, because when you look at, for example, NFTs, let's say, normally because of data limitation on chain, it's not desirable to store the piece of content that is, the forms part of the NFT on chain, but you rather store it on separate databases, such as, for example, and they can be, distributed. So meaning that they can be very secure from an information standpoint. So if you look at IPFS, for example, so, if you look, for example, at the phone, like let's say this was an NFT, then you have the cryptographic asset that is recorded on the blockchain, and then you have the piece of content that is recorded on a separate database, and and the cryptographic asset as metadata capable of pointing toward this piece of content. Now, as mentioned, the piece of content tends to be on distributed databases as well, meaning that it's not centralized, meaning that you can't really get on the database and delete the information. No one has that control, because if it's distributed, then there is not one point of failure. But there are many and multiple. If there is a piece of content which is stored on one of these distributed databases, then you cannot take it down. Now, that intellectual property is normally dealt with by way of license, meaning that we have a negative right, correct? So I can stop you from using my piece of intellectual property. So how do I monetize that? I monetize that by giving you permission to use my piece of intellectual property, subject to certain rules that I lay out, because I am in full control. I can tell you can only use it on Fridays in this particular point. So you can, place limits in terms of geographical location, terms of use, like you can use it on a website, but not, for example, for merchandising, right? So you can decide how can that piece of intellectual property that belongs to you will be used by the person that you're authorizing, right? And in exchange for that, the person that you're authorizing will pay you normally an amount or a share of the revenue that is generated by their use, right? So that's a license, effectively. You authorize someone to do something with your property. Normally, licenses are provided, that should be the case, for a period of time, for a certain, which is called the term, right? It's the term of the agreement. So I authorize you to use this particular piece of property for, say, 2 years, okay? Now, the problem is, if I am a brand and I give you a license over my intellectual property and your use involves storing any piece of intellectual property that belongs to me on IPFS or Airwave, you can't take it down. So what happens when the license expires? You can't take down the metadata. Yeah, okay, maybe you can delist it from OpenSea and centralized marketplaces, but there are decentralized marketplaces as well, and the data is going to be there. So this adds one layer of complexity when it comes to intellectual property. And I think, if you look at intellectual property, if you try to create, and I'm referring mostly to copyright when I speak about IP, especially and trademarks as well in relation to, to NFTs. If you take a step back and you look at it, effectively, the strategy with intellectual property is secure your right. Some rights are registered, meaning you need to register like trademark and patents with the Intellectual Property Office. Some are unregistered in some jurisdiction, like for example, copyright, design rights, there are registered and unregistered, but without losing ourselves in that, basically you secure your intellectual property right so that you can prove that you own it, right? Then you commercialize it by even using it yourself or giving other the permission to use it. And then you make sure that you protect your rights by enforcing it. So by stopping others that are not authorized from using it. That's the problem. Enforcement, the third component, is a problem at scale. Like, that's the problem with intellectual property. If you look at the beginning of the century, massive problem with the music industry. Why? Because you can copy and paste digital information infinitely, correct, on traditional databases.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, it's great when the person that is not authorized is 1 or 2 or maybe 10, but go and sue 2 million people. It's not feasible. So the internet has always presented an inherent problem for an intellectual property standpoint because of scale. Now, add to scale fuel in the sense that you increase the scale by including also immutability of information and inherent distribution and self-custodianship of property. So it's not like you can go to someone's wallet and take it, unless, of course, the smart contract is programmed that way, which is not the case most often. So, this is a problem. And that leads us to 2 points. Brands, especially large brand, but any brand really, should be very careful in understanding and not being dismissive in understanding how their content is used. If you are the person that is seeking the license from someone, make sure that the term is until the expiry of the right, because you won't be able to take it down. So you need to be careful, because otherwise what happens is the moment you sign the agreement and upload the piece of content on a distributed database, you're potentially already infringing, because you know that you won't be able to take it down. So be careful around how you phrase that. But also what it showcases, I think it's an important distinction on the role of intellectual property rights within Web3. I think, IP, as we said, is a negative right, and the strategy around IP has been, that of enforcing against unauthorized users and commercialized authorized users. That is an economy based on deterrence. Effectively, if you don't get my authorization, I'm going to sue you. That's a deterrent. And I don't think they work well as well as incentives. Even as human beings, I think we tend to operate better in a framework of incentives than deterrents. So if you look at, for example, let's say Web 2, right? Music problem, the music industry and the problem with that. When did piracy really stop, or at least decrease to a large degree? When services such as Spotify, iTunes, and I'm not saying that that's great for the artist. What I'm saying is it did remove a large part of piracy, because you're not justified to use pirated information anymore. Why would you risk to catch viruses, download the song that is not what you're looking for? The quality of the music is completely up and down. It depends. Some are crazy volume, some are low. When you can pay, a relatively low fee and get access to a worldwide database of music where you can discover new things, the service is outstanding. The quality it's great, for especially listening, on headphones. So there is an incentive to adopt the original and pay for the legitimate service, right? Access. So when you look at Web3, I think you can even go a step further, because, again, you should incentivize you can incentivize the collection of the original through utility, and provenance is another one. So, for example, Kat Simard, which is a photographer within the space, she is behind the project. Kat is behind the project called Free Hawaii, and I found it was really, really interesting and really demonstrate the benefit of this technology of how or the potential strategy in Web3. So, what Kat did, there was this picture she took in Hawaii and it went viral. Everyone was using it without any authorization. That includes also large tech. Now, you have enforcement agencies, which are agencies that try to help you enforcing your rights at scale. They're not very effective. I mean, they can be effective in some cases. In this particular case, they weren't very effective, not because of the fault of anyone. It's just really difficult to put the genie back in the bottle once it's out. So what Kat did is spin the problem upside down. So create an NFT with the image, which is deemed by all, for all intent and purposes, as the original, because it's the one created by the photographer, by the author. And then the moment it sells, there is a license to go on CC0, meaning there is a waiver on all IP rights, to incentivize everyone to use it as background on Twitter. Why? Because virality creates value in the original. And the picture sold to G-Money for, I believe it's $300,000. So something that was a catastrophe from an enforcement point of view became a great opportunity, to create a viral moment. And I think that just showcases, some of these incentives. And this is an incentive based more maybe on virality, awareness and of course provenance, which now you can prove, with NFTs. Because before, a digital artist, even if you commission the work to a digital artist, you had no idea to immediately prove that, right? So I could just copy and paste it and I would have the exact same work as you. So oops, you disappeared.
I'm still here.
You're still there? Okay.
Yeah.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Yeah. So and I think that's very interesting because it showcases one of the use cases. Another use case could be that of creating utility around the token. So if you look at the Artifact, for example, they created the Punk project. So if you held the Punk, and that's what's great, Punks are not a Artifact project, but they were able to build utility on top of a token that belongs to a different provider and create something unique. So if you don't have a Punk, sure, I have a Punk, you can right-click save my image, but you won't get access to this utility that you're building on top of it, And there is an incentive of a project to build utility, because at the end of the day, if a project is successful, most of the revenue comes from secondary market trade, not from the initial sale. And you stimulate secondary market sale, but by creating something of value on an ongoing basis, So I think that's why within Web3, it's important to focus. We can really focus on building an economy of incentives rather than an economy of deterrence.
I agree. I think one of the reasons I'm so excited about this technology is that it's because it suddenly opens up a way to transfer value over the internet from peer to peer instead of relying on a third party. You can, in a very granular way, link incentives to actions. I think that's really powerful, and I think we're going to be able to use that to build a new internet. That's I guess more open, and where actually people will be able to create and value and capture part of that for themselves.
Also because because at the end of the day, if you look at the blockchain, if you want to really simplify it, it's a database on which information can't be replicated, right? Or at least this is the use case right now. And I think that's important because digital uniqueness is necessary. And I know that there are arguments against it because people say, well, but why should you induce scarcity where scarcity is a problem? Because as human beings, we only value things that are scarce. That's it. You give no value whatsoever to items that are not scarce in value. It's just inherent to our nature. And I don't say, that shouldn't limit access because, again, through CC0 especially, you can provide access to people that are interested. But at the same time, I don't think that you should just have infinite digital information because that undermines the sustainability of a digital economy. I think that what we're seeing now in the Web3 space really represent the Bronze Age of digital information. So we moved from this, it's almost like run parallels to human evolution in the real world, because we started from the Stone Age, right, where there is no concept of property almost in the digital realm, and then we're moving to now having some way of validating ownership, but we are still trying to wrap our head around what are the use cases that work, what's not. I look forward to the age of iron, steel, whatever, you know what I mean, like to progressing in this. This is only the beginning. It's almost like as a species we've now evolved, and now we are experiencing some of the same cycle within this new digital dimension, and I think that's very fascinating.
I agree. And I think that's also a perfect note to conclude our discussion today. I feel like there's a lot of stuff we could have talked about further. Maybe we should do a follow-up.
I'd love to.
Yeah, we should definitely do that. This was very interesting, Omri, and I think it's clear that you're passionate about this, but you're passionate, and I think we try to get people like you on the podcast that are passionate, interested, open-minded, but also critical, right?
I just don't want people out there. Yeah, I just don't want people to because most often the clients that I work are really visionaries and I really respect them, and that's why I love working in this space. I just don't want people to incur in problems because it's really hard to go back in time. That's why at the beginning of the conversation, maybe I adopted a tone that is a little bit more, severe, but I'm not trying to deter anyone. Like just, I don't want anyone experiencing problems down the line when really what they're trying to do is so creative, it's so amazing, and it resonates so much with me. So that's why, Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, by the way.
No worries. It's a great point, and I agree. I think it's important, as cool as this new technology is and all the possibilities that it brings, it's important to keep in mind that be careful when you use that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we see right now that this technology is used by so many to scam so many people. And this might be me ranting, but on Twitter it's been terrible. Where I get tagged in
I
so many
know
posts
it
of
is. Yeah.
verified people, verified accounts. It's absolutely
Yeah.
crazy.
That's more
And
on the
so,
platform end. I think that there
yeah,
should
I agree.
be a solution from the platforms, because I don't think it's a fault of the community,
I
or
agree.
the space. And I think there is a lot of good going on in the space with, a project that are used like for charitable purposes, like Relief, for example. And a friend of mine, Satvik, is one of the people behind it, and I think their work is amazing. And there are other creative use cases. I think the space is incredible. I live there during my work life and as a hobby. After work, I'm just obsessed with it. I think it's a subculture. It's fascinating. It's probably the most important cultural moment of our time. I really do believe that. And yeah.
I agree. Yeah. So this whole technology has a lot of potential, but also, with that potential comes great risk. With power comes great responsibility. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Cool. With that, I think, Omri, thank you so much for your insights here. This was super useful. I learned quite a lot. I think, I'm still very optimistic, but in a more serious way, I guess I would describe it. But that's good. That's good. We're learning here together, so that was fantastic. So yeah, Omri, thank you for joining me on this. Let's do this again sometime.
Absolutely.
Maybe IRL as well. That'd be fun. And then, listener, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. You learned as much as I did. If you liked what you heard, feel free to give us a like or 5 stars on Spotify. You can do that now. And so with that, the Metacast by Naavik is out, and we look forward to speaking to you in the next episode. Cheers.